You know, the Chinese have a saying, nothing can scare us more than the way we scare ourselves.
Hi, I'm Joshua Lim. Welcome to The Library Report, a series where we go beyond the pages of books to explore interesting personalities, fascinating places, and intriguing stories. In this episode, we take a plunge into the spooky depths of horror with a librarian and a special guest. Today we're talking about horror, and I don't understand why people would want to pay to scare themselves, but we're going to find out today. We have Meryl and Kelvin with us today. Please introduce yourselves.
Hi, I'm Meryl Chin. I'm a film librarian from the library at Esplanade.
I'm Kelvin Tong, I'm a Singaporean filmmaker and I love horror films and I've made some of them.
So as a people, we have been fascinated by horror for centuries, for years. I mean, horror stories have been around as long as people could tell stories, right? Why do you think we are so fascinated with horror?
I think horror is always there as a reminder of our mortality. And if you look at, even way back, you look at a lot of fairy tales. Nowadays when we say fairy tales, it seems like, you know, once upon a time,
there's a happy ending.
But actually, at one point, they all originate as cautionary tales. In fact, they are mainly horror stories. Hansel and Gretel, Bluebeard. The ones that Disney makes into cartoons, they are sanitized. But if you go back to the original versions, they are really pretty grim, actually, the Grimm brothers. So I think that tradition has always been with us, you know. So I don't think it's anything new.
There is a very interesting theory called the excitation transfer theory. So this happens when a threat is resolved in a horror film. That negative effect that you feel, all that fear you feel, turns into euphoria. And that's what that theory is all about. And I think in a lot of ways, people watch horror films precisely because of that. Because in a horror film, it's a made-up world that gives us access where our fears are heightened and we get to, or rather the characters in the film get to confront them and overcome them.
You know, within the horror genre, there are so many different kinds of films. The really best ones are the best ones. I think we were chatting the other day and you mentioned Jordan Peele's Get Out, things like that. They're actually social commentaries. If you look at a lot of very good zombie films, 28 Days Later, it's not about the zombies. It's actually about environmentalism or something. But then you're talking about the other kind of horror films where basically there is no deeper underlying message or theme, and essentially it's just a collection of either very sadistic close-ups of surgical instruments entering human flesh, or it's just a really clumsy parade of jump scares.
If you're talking about things that are more geared towards the human psyche, human condition, a lot of them are psychological horror, which you see so many of. The Shining, American Psycho, you have Black Swan, you have Perfect Blue by Satoshi Kon. So many of these really reflect how we as a human race go through with our daily lives, you know, how we have to work around our emotions, things like anxiety, anguish, a lot of it has to do with guilt as well, and how these emotions, and in this psychological horror context, most of the time the characters will be led to perform very drastic behaviors like murder or mutilation. But at the end of the day, I think we relate to it, not the murders and mutilations of course, but we relate to the psychological state of mind. We feel that anguish, we feel the guilt, we feel the anxieties and all that, which is why it makes horror so terrifying.
Less is always more in a horror film, and traditionally,
So including the budget.
including the budget, I mean, a lot of times previously, filmmakers made horror films because they couldn't afford to make other genres. It's half a joke when I say this. Horror is probably the only genre where the audience will not fault you when you don't have enough money for a lot of likes. Horror is probably the only genre where the audience will not complain if the main star is not Tom Cruise. In fact, the more anonymous, the more real that person, the better. But I wouldn't mind bigger budgets.
So would you say that horror books are more scary than horror films?
There are a lot of similarities between, say, horror novels and horror films. But if I'm going to talk about things that distinguish the two of them, what makes either special in their own spheres is that I think horror films is loud, it's sudden, it's scary. Now, that kind of physical, visceral effect and impact, a book can never replicate. So that's unique to horror films. No, but when it comes to horror novels, I think the tools available to a novelist are a lot more insidious. A very simple one is the decision on whose perspective you're telling the story. Now, you could very well tell 3 chapters of a very engrossing story, and at the end of that 3 out of 30 chapters, you realize that you have just been experiencing the world from the point of view of a serial killer. They make you the serial killer when you read I. And that's something very, very insidious, and it's really creepy. So books have that ability to go into the psychological very, very subtly and very, very simply. A book stays with you simply because I think the process of reading a book is very, very different from that of watching a film.
It really does stay with me. And it's all from my own imagination.
You know, the Chinese have a saying, nothing can scare us more than the way we scare ourselves. I mean, basically what it means is that, no matter what CGI is capable of, your mind is a lot more powerful and creative than them.
The book also allows you to explore the person's thought process. So, for example, right, in Misery, the book, it's a different process. So, Annie Wilkes, she kidnaps this writer, Paul, and then she talks about how if you escape, I'll do what the African mine thieves, get to suffer. And then she takes a giant sledgehammer and she
Breaks his leg.
Yeah, she breaks his ankles. But in the book, it's much worse. In the book, she uses an axe to hack off his ankle. And then he wakes up, and this is from the point of view of Paul, the author, who is, now near ankleless. And then she takes a propane torch, and she proceeds to
cauterize
his poor bleeding stump. And then there's this smoky smell. And the worst part of this is that it jogs a memory of him on his honeymoon with his wife. And the smell is just like that roasted pig on the spit.
Now that a book can do, and that I can't do.
Yeah.
Do you think that the horror genre suffers from a bit of discrimination in terms of how perhaps Hollywood looks at horror films? I mean, the last time a horror film got any kind of recognition was Silence of the Lambs. And then after that, when's the last time you heard of a horror film being so acclaimed?
Sixth Sense, I think. Generally, yes. Horror films get very short shift when it comes to awards season. And there's been a trend in the past of not equating horror films with serious cinema. Same for comedies, actually. I think the comedies will feel the same pain as the horror actors or filmmakers. But I think it's changing. Jordan Peele has been winning awards. Then there's also the rise of what in the genre has been called art house horror. So you will see films like Midsommar, Let the Right One In, Babadook. This is a horror which concentrates on characters and emotions rather than jump scares, gore, violence. So I think steadily, the appreciation of horror films is going up.
In terms of books also, is there a tiered ranking of genres?
Actually, it's very similar to horror films because the literary critics they want something that makes logical sense. But that's not in the spirit of horror. Horror is wild and it's unpredictable, and sometimes or most times it doesn't even have to make any sense. It's just something that happens. It's something supernatural. So in that sense, they don't get as much accolade as someone who is writing thriller, for example, or someone who is writing science fiction particularly. They get a lot more attention.
With gore, violence, do you think that the horror genre might be stepping into some dangerous or unethical territory sometimes?
There is a point where you sort of give the audience what they expect to the point of pandering to an audience. So that line is a shifting target, because let's say if you're making a film like Saving Private Ryan, you can't not have the blown up limbs on the Normandy landing, because that's part of what the film was trying to do. So that's necessary. And the line between that and gratuitous violence, where I think in the realm of horror films, there's been a rise in the subgenre known as torture films. So these are films where the bulk of the film involves amputations, gouging of eyeballs, and there is very, very explicit lingering shots on this torture. So there's the line that separates essentially established mainstream horror filmmaking and this more what I call exploitative subgenres.
Art is also very subjective. So some
course.
people might say, yeah, but that was the point of the film. That's why it had to be that way.
There definitely can't be a strict line in the sense saying that, oh, you know, forever this is the line. You fall here, that's acceptable. You fall there, that's exploitative. I say this line shifts because societies shift. Our acceptance of violence, sort of post-computer games, has risen dramatically. I think the amount of violence that is allowed on screens nowadays.
What is unacceptable in the 80s could be very well accepted now, especially in terms of violence. Look at Quentin Tarantino, for example. His films are violence, but because it's so stylized and it makes it so cool, the rating is not as high as you would think it is.
Although
Even though
some would say his form of violence, therefore is more insidious.
it's a bit comical.
Because it makes
so
it very
much blood
fun
that's
to
being-
watch, right?
Yeah.
So there's a lot of subversion of the genre going on. Does this hinder the genre, or do you think it elevates it to another level?
I think by now all sorts of horror conventions we've seen and we are quite sort of used to it. So when something new comes along, something completely breaking all sorts of horror conventions, for example, like daylight horror in Midsommar, the film. So Midsommar, just a little bit of context, is about a group of Americans who decide to go to this rural Swedish village to take part in a Midsummer festival. So it's a shot in this completely bright Scandinavian landscape of green, very vividly coloured wildflowers. You know, you have like jolly music-loving villagers singing along, cozy cabins. So it's very idyllic and very picturesque. So when this sort of beautiful facade cracks, the shock value is even more so when you have something like that is breaking any sort of expectation, when you subvert the nighttime horrors that you're used to and you introduce a daylight, you know, horrors that are committed in broad daylight is something completely new and refreshing.
Thank you so much, Meryl and Kelvin, for that thought-provoking discussion. And thank you so much for watching this episode of The Library Report. Do leave a like and a comment below to share your thoughts with us. If you liked what you saw today, please subscribe and we'll see you in the next one.